The UK's deep sea area is extraordinarily diverse. We have underwater mountains or seamounts, we have ridges, and we have vast ocean abyssal plains. It's known as the cradle of deep sea biology. It's where the science of oceanography began. But it's also heavily exploited. Back in the 1970s, the UK's deep sea area became a deep water fishery. We're now fishing down to about 2,000 metres. The oil and gas industry are moving off west of Shetland and Orkney, moving down deeper into the Faroe-Shetland Channel. It's perhaps for these reasons that the UK was one of the first places to notify a deep sea marine protected area in their waters. This is the Darwin Mounds. It was put in place to protect cold water coral reefs, which are a vulnerable deep sea habitat, an important habitat for other species. And recently, last month, the Scottish Government put in place a number of marine protected areas in the UK deep sea, including the largest MPA in Europe on Hatton Bank. So we've made some really great progress. Unfortunately, it's not enough. Recent research by my team here at Plymouth University has been mapping the distribution of these vulnerable deep sea habitats in UK waters. So we've been looking at where we can find cold water coral reefs and deep sea sponge aggregations in UK deep sea. Then we've used these maps to look at the existing marine protected area network in the UK and ask just how well do these MPAs protect these vulnerable habitats. And what we found is that while 30% of our cold water coral reefs are actually inside marine protected areas, so that's pretty good, things like deep sea sponge aggregations, things like sea pen fields that exist on soft sediment habitats are receiving very little protection at all. Only about 3% of the UK's deep sea sponge aggregations are protected. Now, these habitats are equally important for marine diversity. They're important habitats for other species. They form homes for other species. They provide food for other species. And so they're critical to the safe functioning of the ecosystem. A lot more work needs to be done. We've made some progress, but I think that the protection of vulnerable marine ecosystems in UK waters needs your attention. And not just in UK territorial waters, but in the UK overseas territories as well.
I first saw evidence of damage to deep sea ecosystems from bottom trawling back in the early 2000s, more than 10 years ago. This was in an area in the northern Rockall Trough called the Darwin Mounds, which is just to the west of Scotland. Here you have small reefs of deep water coral growing on mounds. And we actually saw evidence of where trawls had gone across these mounds and pretty much completely destroyed those small coral reefs at a depth of about 1,000 metres. It's quite amazing to think that here we stand 10 years later and we're still seeing this type of damage in the deep ocean. And in fact, that damage has extended over a much wider geographic area across the globe. Just a year ago, in November and December 2011, we were actually on the southwest Indian Ridge in the southern Indian Ocean, more than 1,000 nautical miles from land. And here we saw evidence of extensive damage to these fragile seamount communities from the effects of deep sea fishing. We already knew that deep sea trawling was actually taking place in this area, so we weren't surprised to see extensive damage from deep sea trawlers. I think what did surprise us was the extent of that damage. We actually saw entire areas where cold water coral reefs have been reduced literally to fields of mobile rubble with nothing left growing on that rubble. This is very like some of the damage that we see in shallow water coral reefs, where you get these mobile fields of coral, which actually mean that other animals can't settle back down onto the seabed. They're actually killed by the coral pieces grating together. These coral killing fields, if you like, are something which we have not previously seen in the deep ocean. We believe this is what we saw in the southern Indian Ocean. So it's very, very important that we really come to a better way of actually managing these fisheries out in the high seas, particularly bottom contact fisheries with mobile gears like deep sea bottom trawls. And this is because it's this type of gear that causes the most significant damage to the seabed. But there are other types of fishing going on that we don't even know about at the moment. And this is one of the things that particularly concerned us after this recent trip, that nobody had any idea that these forms of fishing were taking place out on the high seas.
The major part of the world's oceans are deep water. More than 90% of the area is more than 200 metres deep. If we turn our focus towards European waters, say between the Canaries in the south and the Faroes in the north, and we target fishable depths, which are maybe between 200 and 2,000 metres, then there's around 1.3 million square kilometres of these fishable deep waters. That's about the same area as the UK, Germany and France combined. So it's a large area, but this is not by any means a uniform habitat. Okay? There's vast topographic variety in this area, more so than you might see in an equivalent space around on dry land. There are great expanses of canyons in the northeast Atlantic, particularly along the Bay of Biscay, but all the way up the continental shelf, including UK waters and into Irish waters. And these canyons are incredibly vast, grand structures that have important habitats in them, such as oyster reefs, coral gardens and sponge fields. We have observed directly fishing impacts on these areas, but we don't fully understand the impact that this will have on the wider canyon ecosystems. There's still a lot more that we need to know about benthic habitats. Not just things like the ecology and the biology, but really basic things like where these important benthic ecosystems are. And whilst we're in this position, it's important from a conservation perspective that we don't just focus our efforts on those habitats that we know about, that we should keep in mind that future discoveries may be made and we should precautionarily protect other areas so that we're protecting these potential future important discoveries.
So I want to tell you about two individual problems that we've had with deep sea fisheries. One is the impact on the ecosystems on the seabed, and the other is the impact on other fish that live associated with the target fish. Deep sea fish often live as large communities of many different species, and where they've been targeted, there's been a catch of the main target species, and there's been a bycatch of large amounts of other species. In the porcupine seabite, data was collected before a major fishery began by the Institute of Oceanographic Sciences, and subsequent to the fishery having been operational for a few years. And so we were able to compare data before and after. And what we found is the number of fish per square kilometre has been reduced from about 22,000 to just over 7,000 specimens per square kilometre. And the whole population has been reduced, not the 4 or 5 target species that the fishermen were going after. The fishery happened between 500 and 1,500 metres water depth, but since species migrate up and down across the seabed, they often migrate from deeper waters into the fishable area. And so when we calculate the total area that was impacted by the fishery, it's nearly 3 times the size of the actual fished area. And this creates a major problem for all those other species. The other problem is looking at the environmental impact, and I'm going to show a couple of videos which display this quite nicely. You can see in the first video that we have nice pristine coral. It's the white areas on this video. The dark areas underneath the living coral are previously grown older and dead coral. But associated with all this coral are lots and lots of other species. It's a very complex community, and you can see fish coming into the video, and here we see large shoals of fish. So this is a very nice, unfished and pristine community that we can see here. with, as you see, very large numbers of fish towards the end of this video. When we move to the second video, this is in an area adjacent. They're both on the Hatton Rockall Bank, and here you can see almost nothing on the seabed. It's got little pieces of broken coral, and here you see lots of marks of trawl marks running across the seabed, but almost nothing living here, and no fish either. And this has been impacted heavily by fisheries. Now, in these areas, we're trying to create protection for some areas and no-go for fisheries, but to actually identify which areas have already been trashed and which haven't is extremely difficult and very hard for scientists to do because we have very little information to go on. So it's not as if the information exists in the real world. It's very hard and very expensive to find.
Deep sea fisheries have not been underway for very long. In fact, it wasn't until the 1960s and the 1970s before we began to probe the areas off the continental shelves and in water deeper than 500 or 1,000 meters, just to see what was there really. However, we had an economic necessity in the 1980s to expand fishing into the deep sea when shallow water fish stocks began to collapse en masse as a result of incredibly intensive fishing and also poor regulation of those fisheries. And so we saw the deep sea as a new frontier where people could continue to make money and do what they had been doing for a very long time. And it was largely in the absence of regulation to begin with. In fact, we knew very little about the deep sea, and we certainly didn't have the tools at our command to regulate those fisheries in any scientifically sustainable way. Over time, we have gradually been playing catch-up. We've been trying to gather the scientific information which will tell us how many fish it's safe to take. But unfortunately, regulation has been one step behind all along. And this means that we now find an environment offshore in Europe which is no longer the savior of the fishing industry. Indeed, it is an example of the worst excesses of an industry that is not regulated and has destroyed instead of sustaining and nurturing what it depends on. Fish stocks there have boomed and busted, and so when we went down to begin with, we were catching things like orange roughy and round-nosed grenadier, which were abundant, but then the fishery soon exhausted the supplies and moved on to something else. But now there really is very little left down there for us to exploit. And indeed, we also find that the ecosystem itself, the habitats that the fish depend on, have been seriously degraded as a result of the use of incredibly invasive gears in an extremely vulnerable environment. The deep sea is fundamentally different from shallow waters in terms of its productivity, and what the animals down there live on is essentially table scraps dropping from the surface where the sunlight is and all the productivity is into a region of permanent darkness and frigid cold. So the pace of life down there is glacial, which means that the amount that we can take sustainably from a fish stock is incredibly small, which means that economics and biology are in opposition down there, essentially. What is economically viable to take and would justify the expense and fuel of getting to a site and deploying very expensive gears is not biologically sustainable because you have to take more than it's possible for the stock to produce. So now we are confronted by the necessity of retrenching and moving out of those areas that we've been exploiting recklessly and unsustainably for the last 20, 30 years or so, and moving back up the shelf and into shallow water where we can rely on high levels of productivity if only we were to manage those stocks right. What we have to do if we want fisheries to be sustainable and productive in Europe is to go where the fish stock and the productivity is that can be genuinely harvested on a sustainable basis. And that really is in shallow waters back on the continental shelf where fisheries began.